the big story.
The big story. The big story. The big story. The big story.
Thank you, and thank you again, Ferb. All right, let's get into it, everybody. It's time to discuss, you got it, the liars and the warmongers. Now, we've got a lot of different options for all of these different types of stories when we talk about themes. So let's discuss all these maniacs. Just the other day, we were talking about Stephen Miller, right? That was pretty ridiculous, and he was out of control. A liar about Somalia, a liar about immigration, absolutely crazy. We got lies and spin regarding the Venezuela tanker, the process, and the state itself. So let's get into it. Let's get a theme for just that. What's that theme? What can the theme possibly be? Oh, I know. We could go with war. We could go with Edwin Starr. We could go with Dukes of Stratosphere. We could go with the Cult, or we could go with Rollins Band and Liar. Yeah, I'm a liar. Yeah, I'm a liar. I'll tear your mind out. I'll burn your soul. I'll turn you into me. I'll turn you into me. 'Cause I'm a liar, a liar, a liar, a liar. All right, let's go to the first lie and talk about Caroline Leavitt. She has been tasked with lying a lot, and I don't know how she feels about it, but she seems to show no discomfort when she's up there spouting utter drivel. But here's what Caroline Leavitt had to say about the Venezuela tanker attack.
Has been seized, as you know, and the Department of Justice did that in conjunction with the Coast Guard and the Department of War. The vessel is currently undergoing a forfeiture process right now.
It's the process. It's a pageant.
States currently has a full investigative team on the ground, on the vessel, and individuals on board the vessel are being interviewed and any relevant evidence is being seized. With respect to the oil, that's a different issue. As you know, Peter, the vessel will go to a U.S. port, and the United States does intend to seize the oil. However, there is a legal process for the seizure of that oil, and that legal process will be followed.
Okay, so there's a legal process for stealing. Did you catch that? Did you catch that? That's fun, isn't it? There's utterly nothing in their U.S. Constitution, the thing that creates their offices, that allows them to do that during a time of non-war. They don't have any letters of marque and reprisal. And she mentions process twice, legal process. I mean, she's just throwing diapers in your face. Utterly ridiculous. Let's go to the news notes and get some more information on that. Plus, we're going to go to the next lie from Donald Trump. This one exposing himself. But here's a little bit, a taster for the Venezuela situation. I want to give you a little something from Scott Ritter, because Scott Ritter perfectly says it. We, in our Venezuela section in the news notes, we've got Venezuela. Scott Ritter has choice words. The Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov is calling for a full international investigation into the criminal act of Trump to seize the Venezuelan oil tanker. We'll go to Lavrov's statement right after we hear from, you got it, Mr. Ritter. We're going to wait for this commercial to finish. All right, here we go. Now, this one is from Danny Haifong's channel, and Danny, of course, is just phenomenal. And here's Scott Ritter. This is perfectly stated.
Wherever it is now in that saga, as well as, of course, the threat of regime change in Venezuela.
Well, I mean, first of all, let's just call what happened by its real name. It's piracy. So the United States is now a pirate nation. Yay. Because there's no legal justification for what the United States did.
But Scott,
even under U.S. law, it's...
Wait a minute, I thought there was a process. There's a process for committing crimes. See? It's a process, right?
You know, they say that it was FBI agents that carried out this raid as though this was some sort of law enforcement action. It's an act of piracy, straight up. And
those were SEALs. They were not FBI agents. And if they suddenly made them FBI agents, How long ago did they make them FBI agents in addition to being SEALs? Did you hear about that? Did they vet these guys? It's just utterly preposterous. The whole thing is ridiculous. We'll get a couple more seconds of Scott to finish off what he has to say.
And it feeds into a broader narrative of the illegality of the American posture, the illegality of the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. It's fundamentally at odds with international law, but Trump doesn't care. But more critically, much of what the United States is doing and perhaps is planning to do vis-a-vis Venezuela and its neighbors is a violation of American law and the law of war.
Right on. Exactly. And again, they're violating the Constitution without any declaration of war. There are no technical adversaries. And of course, they're not even going up against state figures. They're going up against private entities shipping the stuff, just trying to do their jobs. And a few months ago, the United States issued a State Department release that said that the United States was protesting Iran stopping an oil tanker because Iran had been attacked by the United States and Israel. And, you know, the United States has been assassinating people along with Israel has been assassinating people associated with the Iranian government. Now that, according to the U.S. government, that act against an oil tanker in the Gulf, that was bad. But when the United States does it, it's good. You see how it works? Everything's fine. Everything's totally cool. Now let's get to another lie before we go deeper into the tanker story. Let's go with some MAGA mendacity, because many of the MAGA people don't seem to care about this double standard from Donald Trump.
Video of that first boat strike on September 2nd, but not the second video. Will you release video of that strike so that the American people can see for themselves what happened?
I don't know what they have, but whatever they have, we'd certainly release, no problem.
You said you would have no problem with releasing the full video of that strike on September 2nd off the coast of Venezuela. Secretary Hegseth now says...
You said that. I didn't say that. This is ABC fake news.
Yeah. So now he says ABC didn't say that. He says to ABC, "You're fake news. I didn't say that." And there are so many people, as Danny McAdams brought up, there are so many people who justifiably backed people like Trump and others when previously they were trying to raise that Russian collusion canard, and the pop media was spreading a lot of fake stuff. And now Donald Trump is using that as an excuse. It's his go-to excuse when, in fact, he's the one who's lying. He's the one who's engaged in mendacity. It's stunning. It's absolutely amazing. So let's get over to more details for you. As we mentioned, Lavrov is speaking up about this. The Russians are not happy. So here's the story. And this has a lot more to do, again, with what seems to be a larger long-term strategy to try to isolate China and remove Chinese influence in the Middle East, in Central America and South America, and gain footholds and resources for United States corporate friends and United States politicians. Here's what Mick Wallace has to say. Of course, is he still a member of the EU Parliament? I don't know if he was reelected. I'll have to double check. He might even say in his bio up here. Let's see. No longer part of the madhouse. Okay, there you go. Right. The U.S. is engaging in piracy as it seizes a Venezuelan oil tanker on its way to Cuba. Has any EU member state condemned this lawless behavior? Well, we'll see what the EU has been up to when we look at the EU working to seize Russian assets. They voted today. It's not good, everybody. Has the EU lost all interest in international law? Here we go. Russia demands answers after the U.S. seizes Venezuelan oil tanker. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called for a full investigation into the U.S. seizure of an oil tanker off the Venezuelan coast. He said U.S. forces boarded the vessel after accusing it of carrying crude barred from sale, yet noted that U.S. oil giant Chevron continues to operate in Venezuela and purchases Venezuelan oil. Lavrov said the U.S. must clarify what quantities of allegedly illegal hydrocarbons were on board and explain on what grounds it believes it can conduct such actions. There are utterly none, as Scott Ritter said. Trump announced that the U.S. had seized an oil tanker near Venezuela's coast and intends to take possession of its cargo. Venezuelan Vice President Delcy Rodriguez said the masks are falling, arguing that The move exposes the true objective of the Trump administration behind its so-called war on drugs in the Caribbean. Exactly right. Exactly right. Caracas condemned the seizure as a brazen act of theft and international piracy, recalling that during the 2024 presidential race, Trump openly stated that his long-standing goal was to take Venezuela's oil without offering compensation. Let's go one step deeper. Let's talk about Max Blumenthal bringing up some great points out that Trump releasing the convicted drug dealer and former Honduran President Hernandez emboldened real MS-13 gang members to begin operations there, anticipating greater political support from the Honduran pro-drug, pro-Zed regime to come. So it's not about drugs. It's not about drugs. Watch this. This is amazing. Trump unleashed a wave of gang violence and intimidation on Honduran voters when his pardon of convicted narco trafficker Juan Orlando Hernandez. A conspiracy of bad hombres from Washington to Tegucigalpa. I think I got that. Now, check this out. This is a great bit from an interview from the Gray Zone. Okay, I think you'll really appreciate this.
MS-13 is known to be the armed expression in the streets of the cartels that Hernandez was the leader of. In the trial against Hernandez, there were proof presented by officers of the DEA and other officers of the United States in which money of drug trafficking and weapon smuggling and human trafficking, money of those criminal activities was used to fund maras, to create pressure and to create a terror environment around the elections during 2013 and 2017. So it's not something that I'm saying because I believe it. It's something that there's proof that MS-13 was coordinated with Hernandez to make possible the frauds of 2013 and 2017, and that MS-13 created riots in Honduras to give an excuse for the military forces to attack us, that at that moment we were members of the opposition and the Libre Party and the Resistance Front. So when Trump says, I'm freeing Hernandez, then you have MS-13 going around and frightening neighborhoods in Tegucigalpa and San Pedro Sula and saying to the people that if they didn't vote for Natalie, then they were going to kill everyone in the family. We have more than 900 calls to 911, that is an emergency service in Honduras. And you know that the people that call to those services is a very small group of the people that are receiving these kinds. People very brave that decide to call and to let officers know that. So and after that, we have all the things that have to do with the transmission. So it was an election with a lot of pressure of the strong economic groups in Honduras, with a direct intervention of the President of the United States. It was an election that there were threats and there were actions against the free will of the people from criminal groups like Maras. It was an election with trouble in the transmission of the information. This is an election in which the results have been manipulated. And it is an election where we still haven't seen all the votes because there are still 3,800 cheats that have not been counted already.
So let's remember the ZAs and the influence of the ZAs, which are on hold right now with giant corporations connected to Palantir and others that have places that they have gotten for very cheap, massive tracts of land where they will employ the local people at very low expense in a sort of new colonialist way. They're tied to people like Haley Barbour. They're tied to former assistants to Rick Scott, Marco Rubio, and many of the Florida contingent of the GOP. That is a very, very big deal. And of course, this smacks and tells us of the stink of hypocrisy of Donald Trump as they tell us that it's all about drugs, which is absurd, and we knew it from the start. And there's more about this. Let me show you again some of the unbelievable hypocrisy of the United States when it comes to some of these stories, and then show you just how insulting it is with a vote that came out of the House before we start talking about the EU and their vote to seize Russian assets. First, let's discuss this unbelievable hypocrisy on the part of the Trump administration as the U.S. long-term strategy in South America to block China while acquiring resources and power comes to the fore. Here's some information that I think you might find interesting. And this comes from Dialogue Works, which is where I got a couple of the clips tonight. Ambassador Chaz Freeman, he's in New Hampshire. He's back in New Hampshire, actually. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, Nima, who is the host and creator of Dialogue Works. Watch this. This is great. They've got commentary about Donald Trump's double standard, about Caroline Leavitt, about Venezuela, and about the long-term strategy in Central America as we see other figures connected to the Trump administration's military start to reveal the truth.
Foreign chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said about China.
The rise of the Chinese military. What our goal in the joint force is to create multiple simultaneous dilemmas for all of the adversaries around the world so that they are very cautious and concerned about doing something that would bring any sense of threat to the American people.
What a grandiose statement. I mean, incredible for a chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff to be making a statement like that. He's perfect match for Donald Trump, if you will. Let me go back to another thought that I had in a previous question that applies here, I think. Two generals, both major generals, and one in charge of the reserve components, entire complex of what you might call health-related factors and units. In other words, she was in charge of every hospital, every dental office, and so forth in the Army reserves that would be critical to any major conflict. Critical, absolutely critical. You can't fight a war without your hospitals and your nurses and doctors and so forth. We went with her, and we went with another major general who spent 35 years in the Army Reserve too. And we went essentially to the SASC, and we were talking to a senator in her office alone. Well, her chief of staff was there. And another chief of staff from another senator heard about it and came over and sat in midway. So we're talking to a member of the Senate Armed Services Committee about how inadequate the essential elements of the United States Army are for any war. And they aren't much better in the other components. In fact, they've run a 45 to 50% deficit on recruiting now for almost a decade and a half in all the services except the Marine Corps reserve components. She responded after about an hour briefing by all three of us. She responded with the tour that she had, by the way, this was a Democrat, the tour that she had just taken with the military throughout the Pacific area. They'd gone to Taipei, they'd gone to Tokyo, they'd gone to Seoul, they had gone to Jeju-do, they had gone to Manila. And she was so imbibing of the story that we have China encircled, that we have allies that make China tremble in its boots, that the United States Navy is second to none, even that far away from home, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We then spent another half hour trying to disabuse her of that smoke that had been blown up her ass.
Now, this South America, Central America, China plan is not seeing the United States try to set up yet for a full-on battle against China. What they're doing is they're trying to cause, as you heard, they're trying to cause problems in all these different areas. And they're going to, I think very, very astute observations from a number of people that we've seen on the show and off the show. They're trying to push the Chinese influence in Central America and South America out. The Chinese influence there rising because of tariffs that really, really kicked off under Donald Trump, where they moved some of their operations away from China and started to employ people in Central and South America so that they could avoid the tariffs. So the United States wants to manipulate things there. They've already got interests connected to drug dealers down there, connected to the parties, so they can stir things up, continue the military-industrial complex feedback loop, and keep things militarily going without a full-on battle until maybe they get ready for it. Now, over in Europe, they're starting to mimic the same thing. They're going to go to their central bank. They're going to try to seize the Russian money, and they're going to try to get as close to a full-on battle to freak out the European population as they can to continue generating worry behind their utterly empty rhetoric that the Russians are the threat. That it's the same thing here, that the Chinese are somehow the threat. No, the Americans are the threat, and the Europeans are the threat. NATO is the threat. We've already seen how they overthrew the government of Ukraine. We've already seen how they established biochemical labs. Now let's discuss one other aspect, the lie about Somalia. Remember yesterday we played Stephen Miller, that obnoxious cad, talking about how immigration, it's these ridiculous people coming from Somalia. They ruin their own country and then they come over here. And I mentioned, you mean that would be after 100 plus bombings this year by the Trump administration? Here's some other information that I want to give to you. Remember Wednesday, when on Liberty Conspiracy, day before yesterday, we played Trump advisor Stephen Miller claiming that Somalis who flee to the U.S. leave their home nation because they just can't manage it. Yeah, and remember that we noted that the U.S. has bombed Somalia over 100 times this year. Well, guess what? There's even more information that has just come out from antiwar.com about some of the dark parties with whom the United States is working in Somalia to create what they were doing in Central America in places like Nicaragua with the Sandinista battle and so on, death squads. You got it. I said, that ruling group, as Antiwar reports, has also been working on the ground with U.S. forces. Now, the United States is backing the ruling group of Somalia here. They say they're fighting ISIS, even though they've supported al-Nusra and ISIS, and now known as al-Sharaa in Idlib, and also they guarded the poppies in Afghanistan and worked with the Taliban for years. Well, now the story is they're fighting ISIS. How are they doing it? They're supporting the government of Somalia, and they're forming dozens of death squads. A U.S.-trained Somali government force killed dozens of civilians during an attack on a village in southern Somalia that started Tuesday night and continued until Wednesday morning, according to Somali media reports. According to the Somali Guardian, the attack targeted the village of Jambulu, about 40 kilometers west of Mogadishu in Somalia. And it was launched after the arrival of what is called Alpha Group, a special operations branch of Somalia's National Intelligence and Security Agency that has received training from the U.S. Does this sound familiar? Maybe about a guy who is accused of killing 2 National Guard members in Washington, D.C. about 12 days ago? Training killers? Why? I don't know. Is the U.S. at war? I don't know. Here's this. Garowe Online reported similar details, though it said the attack was conducted by the Danab, a special operations force of the Somali military that is armed and trained by the U.S. Both reports said that more than 30 civilians were killed, and that the village was flattened by the attack, which involved artillery fire. Where are they getting all this stuff? The Somali government said the attack was a special operation against al-Shabaab fighters, but residents strongly denied that there were militants in the area. According to Garowe, doctors at a hospital in the nearby town of Afgoye said more than 100 wounded civilians arrived and that some of them were transferred to Mogadishu. The raid came less than a month after a suspected U.S. airstrike also killed civilians, a dozen, including 8 children. Remember when we reported on that? The U.S. has conducted a record number of airstrikes in Somalia this year, both against al-Shabaab in southern and central Somalia and against the ISIS affiliate in the northeastern Puntland region, where the U.S. backs local forces. That would be the government forces. So that is a bit of an update regarding Venezuela, the double standard of Somalia as we think about that wonderful charmer, Mr. Miller. And we're going to get into the Ukraine stuff in just a minute when we talk about the EU and we talk about their vote today, which is a big, massive, one of the biggest historical moments of this century came today with this vote. There could be no going back. It could be very, very bad. This is a Rubicon-like moment. We'll give you the details. There's only one more step beyond this. So this is not good. So I was in touch with a friend of mine from Washington today who writes a lot about the military stuff, and even he is very alarmed about this. So let me just give you this. As all of this happens on the U.S. side of things, as you probably know if you've been keeping up with the news, in the House of Representatives, the NDAA passed. It passed despite Thomas Massie trying to stop it. So the opening of the news notes for the genetically superior paid subscribers at my Substack has this: war, the NDAA, the GOP. So as they threw all these lies at you, what did the House do? They voted a nearly $1 trillion military budget when there's no war declared. The United States, even now, is engaged in extrajudicial murder, working with the Somali government, and they're lying about the extrajudicial murders that they've done over the past couple months. They've got that sort of respect for you. They just passed nearly $1 trillion of human fecal matter, throwing it right in your face. That's what they did. That's what Speaker Johnson thinks of all of us. And we've got to, what do we, you know, if we were at a party and somebody insulted us and we had been invited over and we voluntarily went in there, we could say, you know what, I'm going to leave now. But they've put their house around us. We are in their corral. We are caged in. What is it, the Smashing Pumpkins? Despite all my rage, I'm still just a rat in the cage. Well, maybe we can find areas of freedom. At least we can communicate about it and learn. That's a positive. Let me give you this. I went into a lot of work today. I worked all day today on this. And I part of the reason that I'm going so fast is because I got so much heavy, and I want to warn you that a lot of this stuff is very, very like intellectually dense. So it's going to be pretty intense for a while. There's a lot of heavy lifting information in this tonight before we get to the fiction tonight. So just want to give you the heads up, okay? So here's the NDAA. The GOP-dominated House passed the so-called Compromise National Defense Authorization Act, and it now goes back to the Senate for final passage. Thomas Massie was justly and highly critical of the bill, and Massie was not the only Republican to vote against the NDAA. He was one of 18 GOPers who opposed the bill, alongside 94 Democrats, citing general concerns among fiscal conservatives that it didn't sufficiently curb overseas commitments. The full list of Republicans who voted no includes, and I put this in italics, Andy Biggs of Arizona, Lauren Boebert of Colorado. You know, and there are positives and negatives, as you probably would say, as hopefully you might agree with me. Lots of negatives to many of these people, but in this case, good that they voted no. Josh Bretschin of Oklahoma, Tim Burchett of Tennessee, Eric Burleson of Missouri, Eli Crane of Arizona, Warren Davidson of Ohio. If these are any of your states, let me know. And I've got a question to ask of you in just a minute when it comes to the EU side of this. Byron Donalds of Florida, Paul Gosar of Arizona, Marjorie Taylor Greene of Georgia did vote against this, Morgan Griffith of Virginia, Andy Harris of Maryland, Anna Paulina Luna of Florida, despite her being a hardcore Zionist. Want to give her the plus on this one. Thomas Massey of Kentucky, of course, John Rose of Tennessee, Chip Roy of Texas, and Keith Self of Texas, as well as Greg Steube of Florida. Okay, now those are the Republicans. Now on the Democrat side, what I did was I took all the names on the Democrat side and I made them super, super small. So if you go over to the news notes, or if you're watching this later, if you just want to freeze frame it, you can see the names and you can check. But for example, New York, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she voted no. This is all alphabetized. Alma Adams of North Carolina, Paul Aguilar of California. We've got Bonnie Watson-Coleman of New Jersey, Mark Vesey of Texas, Nydia Velasquez of New York. I figured she was going to vote against it. And of all things, Debbie Wasserman Schultz of Florida voted against this. It's I don't know. I haven't looked into why she voted against it. I haven't gone to her website. I didn't want to, go to it today amongst all the things, but I am sort of curious as to why she did it. Maybe she's got a post on it. Now, I want to mention some of the things that are part of this NDAA. Now, most of this is bad. It is standing army, bases all around the world, and there were options that Thomas Massey tried to put in, some revisions, amendments that the speaker wouldn't allow. He didn't allow for the amendment process oftentimes. So here is what Thomas Massey tried to put in. The first version, he tried to put in an amendment that would prohibit the use of funds to query foreign intelligence information collected under Section 702 of the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. So essentially, it would nullify Section 702. It would castrate it. It would prohibit the National Security Agency and the CIA from using funds to mandate or request that private entities modify products or services to enable electronic surveillance. So that would end a lot of the AI executive order under Joe Biden, and it would end Section 702 in many cases. And it would only give an exception as authorized under the Communications Assistance or Law Enforcement Act. And that would require a real warrant, not a FISA Act warrant. So if you look into that. Then we've got this. Thomas Massey also wanted to repeal the Smith-Mundt Modernization Act of 2013 and restore statutory prohibitions on domestic dissemination of State Department and U.S. Agency of Global Media propaganda. Remember when they allowed for propaganda? Well, he wants to prohibit it again, which would be nice. That was not allowed into the NDAA, which is always seen as a must-pass bill. Thomas Massey was hoping to get these into this must-pass bill. Then he had an amendment that would prohibit the transfer of Mk-84 2,000-pound bombs to Israel. That was not allowed in for even to be considered for a vote. Again, Massey mentioned that that Johnson used devious work in the Rules Committee to stop these amendments even being allowed to be seen for a vote. Okay? So, prohibiting Mk-84 2,000-pound bombs to Israel, anybody who swears an oath to the Constitution would know that they're not supposed to go to Israel. There's no war. Then he wanted to strike the extension of the Ukraine Security Assistance Act, so that would have gotten rid of $400 million. Then he wanted to strike the funding of overseas humanitarian disaster and civic aid program that costs over $1 million. That, again, wasn't even allowed to be considered by Johnson. That's Mr. Fiscal Conservative. Disaster relief. You're not supposed to even have disaster relief for Americans in the Constitution. Just look at Not Yours to Give by Davy Crockett from 1830. That was a speech he gave. It's not in the Constitution. And again, you can go deeper than the Constitution and say, even if it were in there, would anybody, any gang of people have a moral prerogative to tell somebody, give us your money, we want to do something nice with it? Of course not. Then he wanted to strike foreign aid for funding to Iraq, Lebanon, Jordan, the Kurdish forces, and Syrian groups. He wanted to strike foreign aid from going to the Taiwan Security Cooperative Initiative. And he had a lot of great ideas, strike $500 million in missile defense and foreign aid to Israel. He would prohibit assistance to Israel and prohibit assistance overall to Ukraine. Again, Massey commenting on the effort and Johnson's devious work in the Rules Committee to stop the amendments. They didn't even allow the amendments to get considered. He said, this week we vote on the NDAA. I offer these amendments to restore freedom, promote peace, cut billions of dollars in foreign aid, and put America first. Speaker Johnson and the Rules Committee chose to prevent any amendments from coming to a vote. That's what they think of you. That's what they think of this wonderful so-called process of representation, right? And it's utterly bogus. Just amazing. Incredible. Now, I want to go over to the other major breaking story about Ukraine now. We'll talk about Israel in a little bit, but the other big story about Ukraine has to do with the EU and its robbery. So here it is. Again, heavy on detail tonight, everybody. News reports indicate that the leadership, this was breaking this afternoon. Like I had almost finished this, then I saw this news report. News reports indicate that the leadership of the EU is going to move to seize Russian assets through a tricky, what's called written vote. I had to do some research on this. It doubles the criminality of the already criminal institution. So what we see is the EU Council's so-called written procedure is a quick move mechanism for adopting decisions rapidly when time is short or consensus is clear. Now, in Article 12 of the EU Council's so-called rules of procedure, like Robert's Rules of Order, this is only supposed to be employed for routine administrative or technical matters, or if they think that there's such a widespread universal support of it, that it would just pass it easily, and they don't need to take time for it. Now, that last part is kind of ambiguous. That's a tricky part. But let me give you more, okay? It is commonly employed for routine administrative or technical matters, such as approving minor budget adjustments, extending non-controversial sanctions, or procedural housekeeping. That's the major part of it, rather than high-stakes foreign policy shifts. The move passed. So now, this is the next part of crossing the Rubicon. They're almost at the other side of the river. EU leaders will convene to finalize details of this move. They've already said that it's going to happen. Now they're just going to describe how it's going to happen and on what date. These assets will be considered so-called reparations. And they're going to give this money to Ukraine up to 165 billion euros for military purchases from American contractors and so-called civilian needs, of course, for things like BlackRock between 2026 and 2027. For 1 year only, 165 billion euros. That is Russian assets. I said this would involve loaning Ukraine profits from the so-called assets. Okay? Now, or it could also be potentially the principal itself. And I think that's where they're going. They are getting precariously close to an international conflict beyond the Russia-Ukraine borders. This is World War I level idiocy. This is crazy. And they say that it would be repayable to Russia only if Russia provides so-called reparations. Let me give you some of this information. There's a very good video that describes the information on this cash storage. And this comes to us by Che Bose, who did some searching somewhere, or maybe he already knew about this, but he found a great bit that covers all of this in 2 minutes and 10 seconds.
Since 2022, the West have frozen hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian assets. Before the conflict, Russia held around $640 billion in international reserves. Nearly 50% of that was frozen, over $339 billion. The biggest share sits in Belgium, around $216 billion, almost all of it inside Euroclear. Smaller portions are spread across. over $38 billion in the UK, around $32 billion in Japan, $26 billion in France, around $9 billion in Switzerland, over $16 billion in Canada, and roughly $5 billion in the US. This is nearly half of Belgium's 2025 GDP, which stands at $716.98 billion. And those frozen Russian reserves are more than the Baltic Tigers' GDPs combined. Lithuania, $84.85 billion. Latvia, $43.51 billion. Estonia, $43.11 billion. As Ukraine's financial crisis steepens, the EU is looking for innovative options, massive new borrowing, or using Russian assets as collateral for what it calls a reparations loan. Brussels wants to raise 90 billion euros for 2026 to 2027, promising to cover 2/3 of Ukraine's needs. But Europe is split. Belgium warns outright seizure is the worst option, with enormous legal and financial risks. Even G7 officials admit this is a gray zone. And then there's the question, where's the money actually going?
Ukraine's President Zelensky has addressed the Ukrainian people, saying he will not betray his country's national interest.
The financial system has long been plagued by corruption scandals, the latest one forcing Zelensky to fire his right-hand man, Yermak.
Okay, now, this is really getting serious, all right? And I think you can tell
Since 2020,
Chebos is pretty concerned. The Russians are going to have to come through very soon. They're making great headway into many of the areas beyond even the areas that they originally were going to take in the Donbass, but they've got to go further west because the Zelensky regime just continues to get this ridiculous support from the Europeans and through the back door still from the Americans. Don't forget, again, NATO is buying the American weapons, but the American taxpayer pays for 70% of the NATO defense budget. So what Donald Trump and you know, I have some quibbles with some of the people that I see on the judges program and so on, because they don't go to that extra layer. Some do, but some have not. To mention, don't forget that 70% of the defense budget for NATO is coming from American taxpayers, both us and future generations, okay? So we've got the insult of the NDAA being passed. They've got hundreds of millions of dollars in there for Ukraine. And, of course, Donald Trump says that he doesn't want it. Do you think he'll veto the NDAA? Of course he won't. Of course he sent signals to Johnson to continue doing this. I don't think that Donald Trump really cares whether there's peace in Ukraine or not. What he cares about is continued money for arms manufacturers and the cleanup afterwards. That's what he cares about. And I know the Russians have said, well, we think Trump is sincere. We like, you know, he wants to see some peace. I think either they're just trying to make nice with Trump or they're naive too. Because everything that I see about Donald Trump shows me that you can't trust this man. He is mendacious and duplicitous. He is an utter eel. He's a snake. So let's talk a little bit more about snakes. Because, again, this is a lot of money. The EU did this in a very, very squirrely, surreptitious way. They should not have done this. And what's very interesting is we're getting signals already that Keir Starmer worked behind the scenes to try to convince UK banking interests to support seizing Russian assets. So all of the elites who have ratings that are down near the teens, Starmer, Macron, the German Merz, they are hated by massive numbers of people in their country. And yet they continue to push for this. And we hear Americans saying how they don't have the money to do this. Like I said, it doesn't matter whether they've got the money. They already don't have the money. They're getting the money through borrowing, through central banking, just like the United States. That's why tonight is so important. This is a parallel. They're trying to get a world war started in Europe. I can see it. This is what my friend in Washington said today. This is insanity. And it's up to the Russians to finish it. They've got to finish it militarily. It's the only way. Because if this doesn't stop within the next month and a half and the Russians don't get Kiev to ask for peace, then the Europeans are going to do something crazy. Now, the Russians might just say, you know what, go ahead, take the money. But they're responding already saying, if you try to do it, we will respond by starting to seize European assets. It's just going to get worse. Let me show you about the UK facet of this, because this is unbelievable. New revelations have come to light that Keir Starmer worked behind the scenes to convince UK banking interests to support seizing Russian assets. This guy's like Boris Johnson with a better hairstyle, much like what the heads of the EU want Euroclear in Brussels to do to Russian assets deposited there. The UK-based banks rejected this idea. So here is Che Bose on it. And again, he is doing stellar work. This is just a headline. I'm going to go deeper for you. British banks refused to confiscate $10.6 billion in Russian assets for Ukraine. The largest banks in the UK, and I'm surprised, this is amazing, that inside the City of London they said no, have declined the government's proposal to hand Russian assets worth $10.6 billion to Ukraine. That's amazing. So that might have been one of the recent things they discussed, but let's go back to 2022. Let's not forget what Boris Johnson did, okay? So I want to go back here. We're going to go back to December 11th first, because the Financial Times reported this. Frozen since Russia's 2022 Ukraine invasion, a response to the United States and Western NATO alliances overthrowing the government of Ukraine in late 2013 and installing the pro-Nazi government there with Yatsenyuk in 2014. These assets, this is the British side of things, part of $300 billion globally immobilized by the West, have seen G7 discussions on using interest profits for aid, with the EU approving 3 billion euros in 2024, but hesitating on full confiscation due to legal precedents like the 1980s Afghan assets case. Okay, now there's more to this. This resistance signals deepening tensions in Western sanctions strategy, where banks prioritize liability protection over policy, and good for them, potentially deterring foreign meddling. Russia begins legal action. So here we go. This is from the article. This one comes to us from RT. So here it is. Russia makes legal move against Belgium's Euroclear. Russia's central bank has initiated legal proceedings in Moscow against the Belgian clearinghouse Euroclear, in a move that comes as the EU approaches a denouement on plans to use Russia's frozen funds to bank a loan to Ukraine. Euroclear is the custodian for more than $200 billion in Russian sovereign assets that have been immobilized under EU sanctions. And this is the section I highlighted from the news notes right here. The Bank of Russia announced today that it will be filing a lawsuit with the Moscow City Arbitration Court for what this is worth internationally. It will seek compensation for damages stemming from its, quote, inability to manage monetary assets and securities placed within the depository of Euroclear. This precise amount of the claim has not been, or the precise amount of the claim has not been disclosed, whether it's the full amount or just partial. We, the government of Russia, including the central bank, are doing everything to protect our assets, Deputy Prime Minister Alexander Novak told RT. Illegal confiscations are absolutely unacceptable. So you see how the Europeans are doing exactly what the Americans are doing with Venezuela. I mean, it's just utterly criminal. And I don't want to get used to it. This is criminality on such a massive large scale, global level. And it's happening so much over such a long period of time that I think people will become accustomed to this. Unbelievable. Now, right now, the Russians could hold up to 18.8 billion in assets from the Europeans. And again, Euroclear originally wasn't going to go with this idea unless they could get an alternative. Rather than getting the money from the European Central Bank, which declined to back up any of these actions, they said, if you, the separate nations like Germany and France, could back us up and promise us that if we get into legal jeopardy, you'll back us up, then yeah, maybe we could do it. But who in their right mind, engaging in any international depository for some government with the assets that the government has acquired, would approach any European bank? And again, there are massive amounts of money that we see. Remember, we talked about the comptroller for New York and how he's running for Congress. This guy has spoken up actually in favor of Gaza, which is quite interesting. But at the same time, he is in favor of forcing the credit card companies to put codes on for gun shop purchases, because he wants to make sure that the government of New York knows when you buy a gun through a credit card. So I mentioned that he had threatened the Bank of America and other banks like Chase and JP Morgan to say, we control nearly $1 billion in retirement funds for New York City municipal workers. And if you don't conform and start using that purchase code for gun shops, they did this a couple years ago, and I played a bit of the video from MRC TV that I did. I wrote 2 articles about it. If you don't conform, we're going to withdraw our investments from your banks, all that $1 trillion worth of investments. So you can see the massive amount of sway that these governments have with these so-called sovereign assets and how they can move things and push things, right? And of course, they're not assets that really belong to the government at all. So let me just go over to you here and show you this again. There's more here. I've got here the Russian government claims, here's this. There's more. Russia begins legal action against asset seizure by the EU. Then we've got this. The Russian government claims USAID and Yermak were importing spent nuclear material to Ukraine. Okay? Recent statements from Russian military officials, including Major General Andrei Richev of Russia's radiological, chemical, and biological defense troops, alleged that Andriy Yermak, head of Ukraine's presidential office, personally oversaw the import of spent nuclear fuel from Poland and Romania. This is how corrupt this is. Now, these are the accusations. And what's interesting is, as you start to look around, I took a bunch of articles and I said, hey, I went into Grok. I said, this is what I'm researching, because I wanted to see how Grok would respond. Because you and I know, not only are they doing this, but they also have started bio and chemical labs with Dick Lugar's name in the former Iron Curtain countries. So that was one of my tests. I put in a bunch of these things just to test to see the responses I would get from Grok. And it said, oh, those are unsubstantiated. So I went and I said, you are familiar with the actual biochemical lab in Latvia, which has Dick Lugar's, or in Estonia, which has Dick Lugar's name on it. And it says, oh, yes, you are correct. I was like, yeah, it's been confirmed by Victoria Nuland. Oh, yes, you're correct. Yeah, Barack Obama went in there in 2016 as a senator. Oh, yes, you're correct. So then I told Grok, I said, from now on, why don't you include this in your considerations rather than claiming that these were assertions that had not been proven or that they had been debunked? Because I just debunked your debunking. How's that? Here are the actual articles. Here are the facts. So this is part of this. Check this out. Again, I want to show you this. This is really, really bad. And this is one of the reasons why the Russians have been so concerned, because exactly what they worried about started to happen. USAID, the claims are made today during a briefing, and they suggest that the material could be used for a dirty bomb under a false flag operation, raising radiation safety concerns. Now, here is, I believe this is, here it is. This is AA News. Check this out. Russia accuses Ukraine of nuclear blackmail, violating radiation safety standards. Senior military officials today claimed that covert importation of spent nuclear fuel came from Poland and Romania, and that it raises the risk of a dirty bomb. Russia on Friday accused Ukraine of engaging in nuclear blackmail and violating international radiation safety standards. This is why I called Washington today. All of these things, this is really, really, really bad. Like, I thought the bioweapons labs were bad enough. I've been at this all day. I got up at, I don't remember what time I got up, at like 7 something. I just been doing this all day long. And I don't want to sound like really freaked out, but this is really bad. Speaking at a press briefing in Moscow, Andrei Richev, head of Russia's Radiological, Chemical, and Biological Defense Troops Unit, said Ukraine's actions in this regard are posing a serious environmental and security threat. According to him, Yermak, former head of the Ukrainian presidential office, had personally overseen, very corrupt, the covert importation of spent nuclear fuel via Poland and Romania without notifying the IAEA. Now remember, that the Ukrainians have no problem going after the Zaporizhzhia nuclear plant. Remember that. They knocked out the dam for the water supply to cool the plant. Twice they went after that. This activity raises the risk of a dirty bomb, a nuclear device using conventional explosives and nuclear elements being produced and deployed under a false flag. Richev pointed out that the claim is supported by reports that Ukrainian Security Service, SBU, training includes scenarios now involving the theft of radiological sources and the construction and detonation of a radiological device in crowded areas. Quote, a Ukrainian government report also acknowledges the loss of 68 sources of ionizing radiation in the Kharkiv region, which it classifies as a radiation accident, it said. Contrary to Ukrainian emergency forecasts, which suggest a radiation incident on the border would only affect Russia, Richev warned contamination would likely spread across Ukraine and Europe, similar to the Chernobyl disaster, depending on wind patterns. Further concern is raised about the deteriorating Dnipro chemical plant, a former uranium processing facility. The decaying structures allow precipitation to wash radioactive waste into basements, increasing the risk of contamination. Now, let me give you more information on this. RT had a report on this today, of all things. It was perfect timing for RT. So let me go over here. This is saved in my library. So I've got to get over to the library on this because this is a fairly large, a sizable one from RT. So let me just get this over to you here. I believe this is the one. Let me just double check on this. No, not this one. Hold on a second. Yeah, let me just double check. I'm just going through this, make sure I've got this right. Yes, this covers the frozen assets. This covers a lot of this. And I'll double check on this just to make sure. I'm not sure if we've got the nuclear stuff. But I'm going to go through some of the frozen asset stuff right now. And yes, I've got the nuke stuff. Okay, so here we go. This is a lot of what we're discussing now, okay? So we're going to go to RT's coverage about Zelensky's so-called conditions for holding a vote in Ukraine first, and he's asking for NATO security backups, which is ridiculous. They get a very, very important interview with a man who's involved with a school in Austria, in Vienna, and very interesting. And So I'm going to run through all of this. This is going to be probably about 10 minutes worth of material. So keep this in mind. Here we go. Okay. All right. This is it. Let me give this to you. And I hope you don't mind this being so long, but this is unbelievable stuff. Okay. So here we go.
Therefore, we are in this situation whereby the Ukrainian government is playing for time, trying to drag this peace agreement out.
Let's cross now to head of the Severov Institute think tank in Vienna, Alexander Markovits, to hear his views. You're welcome to the program. Mr. Zelensky says Ukraine will only hold elections if certain conditions are met, ostensibly a ceasefire. Is that fair?
Well, for the Zelensky regime, it would be absolutely fair because they just need some time to regroup, to rearm, and then start the hostilities against Russia again. We can remember the peace agreements of Minsk I and Minsk II, when Russia tried to achieve lasting peace, but unfortunately, Ukrainians always broke these agreements. They broke these agreements also by killing children in Donbass with heavy artillery. They broke these agreements in every possible way. And now they are realizing that the regime is standing on its last legs, that the front is collapsing, and therefore they need some breathing space. And what's better opportunity for that in the eyes of the so-called democratic West than to held some elections where you can only vote for pro-Western parties. So therefore this is a whole charade only for Zelensky and his criminal allies in order to gain some more breathing space, only then to strike again at Russia.
Zelensky also suggested that Ukraine may hold a referendum on possible territorial concessions. He was notably against other referendums in the past, Crimea, Donetsk, Lugansk, to name but a few, but now it appears he's all for a public plebiscite.
Yeah, of course, because he's obviously in a very bad situation since he was never ready to give up Ukrainian territory. And now he's realizing that sooner or later he will lose territory on the one hand. On the other hand, he knows that he cannot basically make this decision on its own, because otherwise his ultranationalist allies would then kill him, most probably. And furthermore, we know that, of course, Ukraine isn't a democratic state, that Ukraine is even suppressing the Ukrainian Orthodox Church with brutal measures. And I am sure we cannot expect this regime to hold any legal and fair elections or referendums, but that they, of course, will fabricate the results they need. And definitely this won't be Donbass being part of Russia, but maybe they will even create the total opposite image in order to facilitate the war until the last Ukrainian and even give it some kind of democratic legitimacy, even if they know personally we are the secret services that even most Ukrainians in the West have given up the eastern parts of Ukraine and especially Donbass as a part of Ukraine, because they know that the people living there don't want to be a part of Ukraine anymore after what has happened in the course over the last 34 years.
But Alexander, can I put the point to you? Even the most ardent of Ukrainophiles in Brussels, in London, and elsewhere in the West must be thinking right now, are we just burning money when we give it to Kiev? Are we just sending it up in flames, wasting our and taxpayer money primarily? What is the point in keeping this going? Because the writing is on the wall. Everybody can see that. Why are they going to continue, as you say, to the last Ukrainian when it's just going to end in defeat and death?
Well, I guess we should always keep in mind that these globalists are basically part of a large global death cult, and this not only involves the war for Ukraine, it also involves the wars in the past in Afghanistan, in Iraq, against Libya. And much of these wars have not been exactly about winning them. Of course, they maybe believed in that, but it was also about devastating these regions and creating as much misery as possible in order to prevent the rise of a multipolar world and to prevent the rise of strong sovereign states. And what the EU and the West are now trying to prevent in Ukraine is the rise of Russia as a sovereign civilizational state, controlling Eurasia and protecting its people from imperialism. And of course, they know that they cannot win this match any longer, but they definitely know that they can hurt Russia as much as possible. And of course, all these elites know that their destiny is basically bound to this conflict. And if the European Union is losing the struggle for Ukraine, they most definitely will collapse sooner or later after the end of this conflict, since it has spent tremendous resources, billions of dollars into this conflict. And as soon as it's over and Russia will win, and this will happen sooner or later, their time will be up. So, of course, they are living the sunken cost fallacy, and they basically don't know any way out of this. And so, therefore, they lead this conflict until the last Ukrainian, maybe soon until the last European, since they are basically living the same imperialist mindset, like, for example, the Nazis did in World War II.
Right. Now, Donald Trump, I think, thinks he's being real smart. And I think he's going with that Rand Corporation idea of bankrupting the EU and the European countries to get them involved with thinking that they can bring down Russia, stopping Russian energy imports going in there. And I think Donald Trump thinks that he's bolstering the dying U.S. petrodollar, which is no longer extant anyway. And also they're going to try to back it up with Southern American and Central American assets. That's what I think is going on. I think Donald Trump and some of the Europeans, they got to be cagey enough to understand that they're bankrupting themselves and they're making their monetary unit worse and worse and worse relative to the already bad United States dollar. Right. So it's just a race to the bottom. And Donald Trump is trying not to slide as quickly. He's trying to grease the gears even more rapidly for them. Right now, let me show you more here about the death cult and the kind of things that these people have been pushing. Let's go to the nuclear story and finish off this interview as we go to this amazing revelation from Russia.
Vienna, thank you, sir, as always.
Thank you for the invitation.
The notorious former head of Zelensky's office, Andrei Yermak, was engaged in importing spent nuclear fuel into the country. That's according to the Russian Defense Ministry, which added such materials can be used for creating a dirty bomb.
No less serious concerns are raised by Ukraine's activities in the field of radiation safety, including attempts at nuclear blackmail by Kiev. A special role in this belongs to the Ukrainian presidential office's former head, Andrei Yermak. He personally supervised the organizational, logistical, and financial flows of importing spent nuclear fuel into Ukraine, without notifying the IAEA and other relevant organizations. The supply routes were organized through Poland and Romania. This poses risks of creating a so-called dirty bomb, with its subsequent use under a false flag.
The briefing detailed the various dangers, radiological ones, biological, chemical ones for Ukraine, for Russia, for Europe as a whole because of Kiev's dirty tactics. And not just Kiev's dirty tactics alone, because we heard how a Cornell University professor recently confirmed that the West is testing pharmaceutical products on the Ukrainian population across 36 labs, 38 labs in fact. And to ensure the secrecy of these studies, they use civilian agencies, NGOs, for example, the now disgraced and liquidated USAID. But before Donald Trump had the chance to shut them down, they funded the Event 201 exercises, which was a sort of rehearsal as to what to do in case of an epidemic of an unknown coronavirus. And this was in October 2019, right before the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic. So very interesting. Also, we heard about the dangers regarding radiation safety. And in terms of that, we heard about how Andrei Yermak, the former head of Zelensky's presidential office, personally oversaw the supply of spent nuclear fuel to Ukraine without even alerting IAEA or any relevant organizations. And the supply routes were organized through Poland and Romania. And this, of course, creates the risks of creating dirty bombs and then false flag operations. What's more, the defense ministry said that the SBU has in fact simulated such a scenario, and the explosion takes place, as always, in a crowded area. Now, moving on, they also pointed out how the defense ministry presented a report to the Ukraine's prime minister citing dangers of radioactive sources being used, that it's classified as a radiation accident, should be classified, but it's not. And again, he highlights that there is a forecast by Ukraine's state emergency services that are looking at a potential radioactive waste accident, and they're saying that it will only affect the Russian side, which is, of course, completely defies logic and is absolutely false. Also, we heard about the Dnieper chemical plants, which is in a dilapidated state, and we're hearing about radioactive material going into the ground, so that could potentially end up in the Dnieper River and then in the Black Sea, and it could contaminate the Black Sea with uranium raw materials. So this is what the West has to think about and understand who they're dealing with and the repercussions of their actions and who they're financing. Let's hear from some more from the Russian general.
Western military and financial aid is provoking numerous violations.
It picks up. I'm going to go back to it in just a minute, but I want to mention again, you heard about the biological tests, okay? So we're going to get to even more information about that. And again, if you do some searching about that and you bring it into, you can test it with Grok yourself, because I already was familiar with some of those things because I've shown some of the documentary footage on the ground of the people around some of those biolabs. But evidently there's more to it than that. We'll give you some more in just a second here. It's amazing. It's just amazing. The corruption inside Ukraine, just unbelievable. Here we go. There's some more.
Russia's defense ministry continues to record violations of the chemical weapons convention by the Kiev regime. More than 600 cases have been found of using banned chemicals so far this year, in particular in Lugansk and Donetsk. And they were also found as far as the Belgorod region, so closer to the Russian mainland, and also attempts to poison Russian officials, and the new heads of the new territories are also being thwarted. They continue to try and do that. But the Russian forces are, of course, battling with that. But most worrying from what we heard today at this briefing is the fact that Ukrainian armed forces are being trained to use chemical munitions for Western-made artillery systems. Now, what does this mean? They found manuals on abandoned Ukrainian positions, and this is all approved by the Ukrainian government because there are their stamps on those manuals. So they're openly violating the Chemical Weapons Convention, and they know it. And then at the same time, what we're seeing is that they're being supplied with a record number of Western-made personal protective equipment, which is very strange for a country that doesn't have chemical weapons. Now, we'll just take a look at some of these figures. Since the start of the special military operation, NATO countries have already supplied Ukraine with more than 280,000 arms protective suits and gas masks, 150,000 sets of antidotes, and 20,000 tests for the rapid detection of chemical warfare agents. And this year so far, Zelensky has ordered for another 360,000 units. Now, why? All of this, of course, is very worrying, and Russia's defense ministry is ringing the alarm.
Okay, something else we're across today. Moscow is launching legal action against the Brussels-based depository Euroclear. The Russian Senate.
Okay, just had to wait for the actual cue to, once you press it, it wasn't coming too quickly. So before we go into the Euroclear matter, I do want to go into a little more backing information that I dug up today to make sure that I give supportive information about this. I'm going to go back to the news notes on the chemical and biological stuff, okay? So just want to give you this. Let's see. Let me see. Rishev today also claimed that USAID facilitated drug testing, potentially including chemical and biological agents, on Ukrainian citizens in over 30 facilities. This echoes earlier 2022 claims during the invasion. Now, I want to remind people that a former Biden official claims that if NATO had simply promised not to expand into the Baltic and Iron Curtain nations, Russia would not have invaded Ukraine. Well, of course, she's close, but essentially NATO, through most of its members, especially the United States, did promise not to expand into those nations, and then it expanded. Additionally, the U.S. engaged in overthrow of Yanukovych in late 2013, installing the pro-Nazi Yatsenyuk, aligned with Tyahnybok, and that regime began a 10-year slaughter in the Donbass, and, of course, brought in the chemical and biological weapons plants that we saw Victoria Nuland acknowledge in front of Marco Rubio in the U.S. Senate. And, of course, let's recall Boris Johnson's role in extending this war. Let's not forget about that. The Guardian, arms dealer Christopher Harborne paid Boris Johnson, we heard about this a few months ago, £1 million UK to convince Zelensky not to sign the Istanbul peace deal in March of 2022, which would have spared the lives of an estimated 1.6 million Ukrainian troops who are now killed in action or permanently disabled. Now, I want to remind you, the biological chemical weapon stuff started in 2005, 2006 with Dick Lugar and Obama when Yanukovych was elected back then, and they knocked him out. They got him out then. They did the Orange Revolution back then. And that's when Lugar and Obama, you can see the headlines, they brought in, like $100 million to start all these plants. And they also went to Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania and other places where they have obviously massive cancer clusters. Okay. Now I want to go into a little bit more about the EU situation and talk about this legal battle. This is massive. And they are just trying to poke a bear, pun intended.
Bank's claim states the EU plans to use its frozen assets, essentially Russian taxpayer assets, to fund Ukraine are illegal. The country's deputy PM made clear the Kremlin will do everything in its power to resolve the issue.
We are doing everything we can to protect our gold and foreign exchange reserves, including the central bank, because illegal confiscation is absolutely unacceptable to us.
So, is this game best played by two, as they say online?
Our sovereign right and the protection of state interests come first.
So the Russian government sounds like it finally got tired of watching this eternal charade of European officials squeezing into their clown car to argue over exactly how they're going to rob their own bank of Russian cash that they promised to safekeep. And now they've decided, the Russians, to take legal action, which effectively turns the EU's attempted bank heist into a full-blown Mexican standoff. The EU is threatening Russian assets held by Belgium's Euroclear, and Russia could now use the EU's actions as the precedent to yank the 16 billion euros of Euroclear assets the CEO of Euroclear says that Russia holds, plus whatever other European knickknacks are lying around in Russia, like, hey, maybe factories, funds, assets. And the Prime Minister of Belgium, where Euroclear is based, wants absolutely zero responsibility for the fallout of stealing the Russian cash. So he's threatening the EU with legal action if they go over his head.
A great deal of goodwill has been shown, but there is a gap between the goodwill to do something and actually being able to do something. And that gap now needs to be bridged. You can't rule anything out. If a decision is taken that, in my opinion, is at odds with the law and therefore makes no sense and poses major risks for this country, you can't rule anything out.
So the EU seems perfectly happy to ignore all that because they've decided to fast forward past all those pesky laws and procedures and member state votes. And instead, get this, the unelected EU executive has declared a bloc-wide emergency. Apparently, the war has made them so broke, they say, the war they aren't even in, that they simply must do this smash and grab. Democracy and legality and any actual voting, well, they can all wait in the car outside with the engine running. The whole point of them doing this is to dodge any dissent or the slightest whiff of common sense that might be presented, like the Belgian or Hungarian prime ministers pointing out that the so-called fiscal emergency simply doesn't exist. And while all this is happening, it would be a real embarrassment for the EU if the cash were unfrozen and spirited away by its actual owners while the EU is still fumbling with their ski masks in the clown car. So now they also want to lock in the Russian funds permanently, even though the freeze is legally supposed to be renewed every 6 months. But look, renewing requires votes, and votes are a pain. So, and it also might not give them what they want. So naturally, the plan is to get rid of those too. And all of this because they want to impress their girlfriend Zelensky with a gift of at least 100 billion euros of cash that they do not, in fact, possess, showing Queen Ursula's favorite foster kid, Ukraine, exactly how democracy and rule of law are done in Europe, by going around them frequently.
That's right. Just like the United States. So we have those two big issues, along with the Somali issue. Haven't even gone into Israel yet, Israel-Gaza. Just the absolute lawlessness of the Trump administration. Haven't even discussed Kilmar Abrigo Garcia and the lawlessness there. But the brazen and utterly shameless behavior of the EU is mirrored with the Venezuelan activity and the United States support of Israel and Speaker Johnson in all of these major figures. Johnson, Trump, the EU von der Leyen, the British Keir Starmer, all of them. They're all standing up like mountains of mendacity. It is such a stark day to see this coming as Christmas approaches that I think it's important to keep this in mind. And I want to ask you, and I saw some great comments inside Rumble. We're going to say hi to everybody in there now and get some of your great thoughts. I've been sort of storing some of these up. Want to ask you, first of all, do you think that the Europeans are going to seize these assets? That final moment, do you think they're going to do it? So you let me know. Yes, seizure. No, no seizure. And if you'd like to, again, reasonable, limited speculation. If you'd like to tell me what you think the Russians are going to do, if they will respond by seizing European assets, let me know. And if you think this is going to build into something even bigger and more dangerous on an international military conflict front, you let me know. I don't think it's going to come to that, but they're getting very close. Utterly insane. Totally crazy. And it's all for their corrupt friends to keep the money flowing. And this is what Donald Trump is doing. Whether it's in Honduras or it's in Ecuador or he wants to get Brazil, he wants the Venezuelan oil, whatever it is, it's all for special interests and to prop up the dollar. They're going to prop it up as long as they can until the balance comes around when they've got their so-called digital stable coin, which is a non-stable coin that requires any financial institution that wants to participate to create a digital so-called coin to buy U.S. debt, essentially propping up the U.S. debt some more.